Hello, and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Friday, March 7, 2025, and today, on episode 18, I'm joined by Dr. Evan A. Laksmana, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Southeast Asian Security and Defence and editor of the Asia-Pacific Regional Security Assessment at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Hi, Evan. Really appreciate having you on the show this week.
I appreciate you having me.
Now, in a week of continuing mass civilian casualties from military airstrikes and ongoing battles in major towns like Falam and Bammo, before we start our interview, I want to just quickly highlight two noteworthy developments in Myanmar this week. First up, relationships between resistance forces have both strengthened and fractured this past 10 days. It was reported on Monday that on February 27, 6 resistance forces in Magwe Region's Salin Township signed a 13-point consensus to merge together and create a Salin-based alliance force. This ostensibly brings together all of the existing resistance groups operating locally in that township. The Myanmar military has 3 infantry battalion bases in Salin, and conflict and violence against civilians there occurs regularly. The concrete outcomes of this merger remain to be seen, but in general, unity amongst resistance groups, especially in Anya and the Dry Zone, is something to be approved of, if not applauded. This comes after the Chinland Council and the Interim Chin National Consultative Council signed a reconciliation agreement in India last week to merge into a new body called the Chin National Council. As has been covered on this podcast, resistance to the military in Chin State has been riven by the schism between these two groups, which both hold considerable territory in the state. While no further details have been agreed upon, the agreement is widely seen as a positive step forward, and hopefully we'll have an interview on the prospects for it for you next week. In northern Shan State, however, tensions between resistance groups have only increased recently. In Kutgai Township this week, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, members thereof, supposedly killed 2 Kachin Independence Army, or KIA, soldiers that were in plainclothes when they opened fire on a crowd protesting a nearby gold mine. Protesting the gold mine was destroying their farms. Multiple civilians were killed. The KIA has not responded on the supposed soldier deaths yet, but it has been more vocal in admitting that conflicts with the Taang National Liberation Army, or the TNLA, continue to pose challenges. Several scuffles in mixed-controlled areas between the KIA and TNLA have broken out this year, with injuries, detentions, and weapons confiscations. And closer to Yangon, Myanmar Now reports that the Alternative National Unity Government, or NUG, is investigating a murder allegedly committed by the Thayawadi District People's Defence Force, or PDF, Battalion Number 3801, which is under NUG command. That group is accused of killing the leader of the Yangon Western District PDF, People's Defence Force, last month. There is speculation the murder had something to do with the fact that both groups are involved in illegal logging in Bago region. It's unlikely the truth of the matter will really come to light, but the NUG continues to signal its investigations, even when it lacks the capacity to make a judgment or enforce a punishment. The next major development this week was a visit to Russia by coup leader Senior General Aung Hlaing. The general arrived on Monday and had a sit-down with Russian President Vladimir Putin soon after. He gifted the bemused dictator a biography of Burma King Alampia, who was the founder of the last great Burmese dynasty that fell to the British. Curiously, Aung Hlaing also cited a prophecy involving the Buddha, a rat, and friendship between Myanmar and Russian kings. A video of that meeting immediately inspired despair and considerable amusement on social media. Aung Hlaing and Putin signed an agreement for a small nuclear power plant in Myanmar, the realization of which in practice does seem unlikely. However, that does follow on from the partners signing a similar agreement on cooperation for peaceful uses of nuclear energy back in 2023. Min Aung Hlaing also had the opportunity to reaffirm his support for Russia's special military operation, I quote, in Ukraine. While the Myanmar military does buy a lot of military equipment from Russia, and it has sent high-level delegates to Russia since the coup, this is the first time that Min Aung Hlaing has been treated with full head of state honours there. And he might be back again soon, as Putin announced that a military unit from Myanmar would take part in the military parade in Moscow on May 9th, which will mark the 80th anniversary of the World War II victory over Nazi Germany. Putin said Min Aung Hlaing is also invited. Min Aung Hlaing travelled to Belarus too, which, under leader Alexander Lukashenko, is essentially a client state of Russia. He plans to sign several bilateral agreements there too. But as a technically separate nation-state, this means Belarus gets the ignominious distinction of being only the fourth country to host Min Aung Hlaing since his illegal 2021 coup. Now, Russia's sale of weapons to the Myanmar military and its staunch support at the international level is obviously a major factor in the military's ability to cling to power through violence year after year. But Myanmar's nearby neighbours are more important to resolving or mitigating the humanitarian and economic disaster taking place in Myanmar today. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, moved quickly after violence broke out following the 2021 military coup, agreeing on a 5-point consensus that included the Myanmar military. That consensus demands an immediate end to violence, the delivery of humanitarian assistance, dialogue among all parties, the appointment of a special envoy to Myanmar, and the envoy's direct engagement with all stakeholders. Since then, there's been several chairs and envoys, but essentially not much progress. 4 years on, most people affected by the coup and military rule in Myanmar flatly deride the consensus. So, to our guest, Evan Laksmana of IISS, is the consensus that the consensus has failed fair?
So I think the context for when and how the 5-point consensus emerged is also, I think, important. The immediate post-coup environment back in 21, let's say the first month or so, there were a lot of hesitance among ASEAN member states to even want to engage on the issue altogether. You know, the joke among some ASEAN member states is engagement a necessity? Can we all just watch CNN and see how this unfolds? And so as things progress, obviously that option is no longer on the table. But there is no mechanism by which ASEAN can be committed to engaging on the issue at the time. And so the fact that Indonesia, who was not chair at the time, Brunei was the chair at the time, Indonesia had to make a call at the highest level. And in fact, it was Indonesia's first position for Myanmar to return to democracy that sort of led the path eventually to having the ASEAN leaders meeting and having the 5-point consensus, and eventually making the ASEAN 5-point consensus as the main reference point. So the first context there is relevant because without the 5-point consensus, ASEAN can just sit back and watch CNN. And this actually commits ASEAN to work on the issue, for better or for worse. But so that's the main first context, that it allows ASEAN to be committed to the issue of Myanmar, and it allows the responsibility, first and foremost, to remain within ASEAN to help resolve the issue. The second context, I think, is the ideas that you now see as the 5-point consensus was not necessarily something that was an actual consensus in the process of how that came about. This was an idea that was put on the table by 5 or 6 of the ASEAN foreign ministers who came to Jakarta the night before the ASEAN leaders meeting. And so this was then agreed upon at the actual ASEAN leaders meeting. For those of you who aren't aware about how consensus is reached, and therefore we call it the ASEAN 5-point consensus, you simply have to object. And if you did not object, everybody assumes you accept. And that's how the story of how Min Aung Hlaing came and did not object. And therefore they call it the ASEAN 5-point consensus. those ideas made sense at that time. But what wasn't made explicit are two things. Number one, the idea actually had an expiration date in which those ideas of the visit, the special envoy, cessation of hostilities, all of these things made sense 4 or 5 months out when things have not been as bad as things are right now. And so I feel like the contextual timing at the time made those ideas seem like the first order of priority, right? You have to stop the violence, and therefore you can deliver aid, and then therefore you can have all-inclusive dialogue. How do you get to these three outcomes? You need to visit, and you need to have a special envoy. So if you break down the 5-point consensus into 3 broad outcomes and 2 pathways, that was the logic of delivering 5-point consensus as a package whole, not piecemeal fashion that we've seen. And certainly nobody had talked about during the ASEAN leaders meeting or after that the ASEAN special envoy has to be the foreign minister. It is now accepted as a matter of practice, but it wasn't designed to be a rotational thing in which every chair has its own approach. In fact, one of the reasons why that idea came about was because of the complaint that many in ASEAN had about the UN special envoy, who at the time was seen as a part-time special envoy. Sometimes she's in Bangkok, sometimes she's not. And so the idea was actually to put somebody full-time. But of course, ASEAN mechanics move somewhat differently than as expected. It became full of intra-ASEAN dynamics and tensions. And so Brunei sort of presented itself as the mediator, and therefore they volunteered themselves as the first special envoy. And that became a practice in which subsequently the foreign minister became the envoy. But the point of me telling this story is to contextualize why the 5-point consensus was necessary at the time, given that there is no mechanism to commit ASEAN to addressing the issue of Myanmar, which until today I still believe is the prime responsibility of ASEAN. If there is one issue that is absolutely within ASEAN's responsibility, it's Myanmar. It's 100% the responsibility of ASEAN. And number two, that the idea made sense at the time, but the leaders did not feel a sense of expiration date. And so obviously things have moved very differently than 2021, whether it's things on the ground, whether it's the polarization, whether it's the subsequent changes in how each special envoy addresses the problem. And so we're now sort of on a path-dependent trajectory of basically balancing between looking at Myanmar as a hot potato. I don't want to touch this. Let's do as minimally as I can and then pass it along. Versus actually, before this becomes a hot potato during my chairmanship, how do I address this issue head on? Of course, underneath all of this dynamic is the fundamental question, which is another and perhaps my last point on the context, which is the role of Thailand. Thailand in 2021 is very different than Thailand today. But Thailand in 2021 was very much a hindrance in how ASEAN would have loved to engage on the issue. Of course, everybody in ASEAN knew and still knows that there is no Myanmar solution, if you will, quote unquote, without Thailand. That's, it's a basic reality that we all accept. But in 2021, it was very difficult. A lot of the veto and a lot of the blocks about how should we move forward to engage Myanmar came from Thailand in 2021. And the relationship between then Thai foreign minister with the rest of ASEAN, particularly with Indonesia, wasn't particularly great. The role that Pauline had as Thailand sort of, I guess if you want to call her special envoy on Myanmar, right, also make things a bit more complicated back then. But now I think the moment is also different. So the context with Thailand is also different now as well. So that's why I feel like there is an evolution to how, yes, a 5-point consensus remains the glue that binds ASEAN to Myanmar. But now that we have a more workable Thai side, what can we do to bring in Thailand even more? So that's where we are right now, where we are what I would call at a juncture point between 3 options. Do we stick to an ASEAN-only approach? Do we stick to an ASEAN plus approach where we bring in China, India, US, and others? Or do we go back to what is known as an ASEAN minus approach? So we don't need to bring the whole of ASEAN, but just focus on Thailand, maybe Malaysia, maybe Indonesia. So a smaller subgroup within ASEAN that can move the envelope further, whether it's through the Troika mechanism or through something else.
All right. So, Evan, in your view, those are the three options. There's no fourth option of somehow replacing the 5-point consensus or changing it. I hear you, but how could ASEAN more productively create influence with the Myanmar military to change their approach, given the military is still determined to detain or kill anyone in Myanmar opposed to their rule? Could ASEAN military-to-military discussions help?
So one is on the military side, and two is on the 5-point consensus. For me, there is nothing inherently wrong with the 5-point consensus. What is inherently problematic is the execution of it. The key is not to replace the 5-point consensus, but will there be a way in which a particular chair would be enlightened enough and willing to spend capital enough to find what I call an implementing framework? How do you get an implementing framework without changing what in ASEAN parlance called changing the nomenclature of the document? Which is, do we need to change the term? Should we not call it ASEAN Special Envoy as opposed to calling it ASEAN Chair's Special Envoy? Do we need to change the term because there's no point having the visit? That's already met anyway, right? Do we need to use the phrase mediating as opposed to something else, right? Changing this nomenclature and then potentially replacing or abandoning 5-point consensus requires, guess what? Another ASEAN leaders meeting, which is another waste of time. Nobody wants to re-litigate the issue that was very, very hard to get us to that point back in 21. Keeping in mind, historically, it's very unusual for ASEAN to meet at the ASEAN Secretariat, who wasn't the chair at the time. It's very unusual to do it on behalf of an intra-state problem. At the time, it wasn't clear the scale was as bad as it is now, but it was pretty bad still. And so ASEAN actually took a lot of steps that were unusual, including disinviting the political representation of the junta, right? And so those things may not seem like a big deal for all the people inside Myanmar, which is fair because it doesn't stop the bleeding, it doesn't stop the violence. But the key point now is not to abandon it. The key point is, will there be a mechanism that an ASEAN chair can say, you know what? I want to implement it in this way, and this is an implementing strategy that I have discussed with my fellow ASEAN members, including stakeholders in Myanmar, and this is how we're going to implement it. We're going to have an office of the special envoy that's not just a 1-year term, it could be 3 years. Here's how we're going to create a task force inside Myanmar the way we did it after Cyclone Nargis in 2008, if I'm not wrong, in which there's an ASEAN presence. Here's how we're going to work with the AHA Center, but also local ethnic groups to distribute humanitarian aid. Here's how we're going to negotiate security protection for this distribution that involves local stakeholders, including perhaps members of the military. There's many aspects of an implementing framework that could have been discussed, but has never been discussed. I'm not saying it'll be acceptable by stakeholders in Myanmar, but if it's never been discussed, if it's never been put forward, what are we talking about, right? Are we simply saying every year it's going to be a race to check the box of saying we met the 5-point consensus implementation that year? And here's the thing, right? It's up to ASEAN to determine what that endpoint is. Just like it's up to ASEAN to come up with the 5-point consensus, it's up to ASEAN to come up with, here's how we say we can be done. Or here's how we say we're going to implement it, and then we say it's done. So theoretically, there's nothing fundamentally, principally bad in terms of the content of the 5-point consensus, but it's the execution of the 5-point consensus that's very frustrating because they don't understand the expiration date issue of those original 5-point consensus. On the military side, what I think is interesting is the perception or the narrative, I guess, that there is a mill-to-mill or military-to-military channel that can be activated. I think there's a lot of I guess kids these days would call it delulu, in that sense, because, mill to mill is actually counterproductive, because guess what? More than half of ASEAN armies would quietly sympathize with the challenges of the Myanmar military. You have problems with internal unrest? So do we for the last 20 years. Welcome to the club. And so I don't think pushing for a mill to mill channel is necessarily productive. Number two, I don't think Min Aung Hlaing in particular, or perhaps the Tatmadaw in general, would listen to a mill to mill from fellow ASEAN member states, except maybe Thailand. If there is a pathway to influence or communication, it's definitely the Thai military, definitely not the Indonesian military, despite what some in Jakarta might feel, not the Singaporean military, absolutely not. And so, Philippines also. So what? Vietnam? Maybe, but Vietnam is ultimately not interested in these kinds of issues on the military side. Laos and Cambodia, I think they tried a little bit, right? Although I'm not sure they tried from a mill to mill standpoint. So if there's any hope, we go back full circle to Thailand again. If we assume that there is such a thing as an effective mill to mill channel, but my own view of a military to military channel for ASEAN member states, not only is that not a good idea, but it might actually make things worse.
Thanks, Evan. Next question. Considering this implementing framework you've brought up, is 2025 the year that it happens? This year, Malaysia is the ASEAN chair, and that country's government speaks out a little bit more on Myanmar in general than, some other ASEAN members. And Malaysia is a democracy like Indonesia, which chaired in 2023, as you've mentioned. But for all of Malaysia's apparent goodwill, bilaterally, Malaysia continues to deport Myanmar origin people directly back into the hands of the military regime, which persecutes, even conscripts them. So, how to make sense of this? Based on your expertise, what is it likely that Malaysia and its new envoy will do?
What is frustrating, and understandably so, I think, for people in Myanmar, is that chairmanship reliance, as in like every year it may be different, means every chairmanship has a different agenda, and therefore you have to reinvent the wheel to try to understand that chairmanship. And it cannot be done by a heuristic device of Malaysia and Indonesia, one democracy bloc, so they'll be fine. It's very not. I'll give you an example. Indonesia will be very different now than it was under Jokowi. In fact, Jokowi in the year of 2021 was still committed to the issue. In the year of 2022, and even when Indonesia became chair in 23, the commitment wasn't really there compared to the commitment in 2021. So democracy or not is not really a good benchmark to understand whether or not they're going to do something for Myanmar. Number two, the do something part itself has to be redefined. If there is some expectation that any ASEAN chair is going to suddenly magically resolve the conflict now in a way that's acceptable to many in Myanmar society, I think they will be sorely disappointed. At best, you will have an ASEAN mechanism facilitating some of those conversations. So, for example, an idea from a year or two ago is that when Indonesia started the all-inclusive dialogue process, that can be sustainable, and that at some point, an ASEAN mission can actually take that dialogue that happens outside and bring it inside Myanmar, right? That's like an ideal scenario in the future where ASEAN facilitates that dialogue. But even then, ASEAN cannot do anything on cessation of violence or aid delivery even. Because if ASEAN is always overly committed to only delivering aid through AHA Center, for example, that's a problem, because AHA Center is managed by an ASEAN governing board that includes the Myanmar official representation. I want to say Ministry of Social Affairs, I think, if I'm not wrong. I could be wrong, but it includes a formal representation from the Myanmar government, for example, right? So I think stakeholders in Myanmar should not see ASEAN chairmanship every single year as, will this be the one? Will this be the one that will finally help us, achieve our maximalist goals? I think what is perhaps more reasonable is, number one, to look at ASEAN chairmanship not within the next year, not even this year, but within the next 3 to 5 years, which is to say, Thailand is going to come up at some point as ASEAN chair. So next year would be Philippines. They have South China Sea as a priority issue. After Philippines, I want to say Singapore, and then Thailand, right? So if you want to think about ASEAN, you have to understand ASEAN timing. ASEAN timing is not 1 year, never has been, and never will be. And so for me, this is why the initial discussion in 2021, as I remembered it at the time, was to develop that implementing framework that could carry over regardless of who the chairmanship is. As long as there is no jumping off point document or a sustainable document that's more than one chairmanship, and as long as it all comes back to how each chairmanship defines the 5-point consensus, then I'm sorry to say, short of Thailand as chair, Myanmar will never be priority number one in any of the ASEAN chairmanship. Malaysia's priority number one isn't going to be Myanmar this year. They have like 3, 4, 5 more pressing issues as defined by the prime minister, who may or may not have an agenda on Myanmar. And if you look into the appointment of Thaksin, for example, as an advisor to Malaysia, to Anwar in particular, it's a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, Malaysia can sell it as, we finally bring somebody who may have leverage in Thailand more than we could. An interesting proposition to make publicly. But also, it may hit two birds with one stone, because Malaysia also has a problem with southern Thailand. And so Thaksin going around southern Thailand trying to help address the issue is also a nod to Malaysia as well, right? And so it's not just about Myanmar, it's also about southern Thailand for Malaysia as a matter of Thailand priority engagement, right? And so this is where I think, going back to your initial point, I don't think it's realistic for Myanmar stakeholders to pin their hopes on a single ASEAN chairmanship to begin with. And certainly not any single chairmanship can address these questions. And what I feel right now in ASEAN is there is a sense of perhaps crystallization, if you will, for lack of better terms. What is the issue of the day when it comes to the violence in Myanmar? In many parts of ASEAN, they see it as two pots of issues. One, the immediate post-coup environment around the violence and the attacks and the election and all of these things. And then the longer sets of issues around nation building. This is the relationship between the ethnic groups and the capital, between the ethnic groups, federalism, civil and military relations, and what have you, right? The worry, I think, in ASEAN is that, can you address one without addressing the other? And if you say no, you cannot, then I don't think ASEAN has the capital, bandwidth, or ability to help shape the nation building questions for Myanmar. That has to be a Myanmar-owned and a Myanmar-led process. In fact, I probably would suggest you do not want ASEAN to be involved in those questions anyway. I don't think ASEAN would be the best place to offer you advice on federalism or ethnic minority protection or the role of the military in government. So I think this is where separating those two issues and figuring out, is there a way to continually engage and support Myanmar without moving into nation building, but addressing the immediate post-coup issues, is perhaps a more workable policy option without over-promising that ASEAN will come and save the day, because that's never going to happen.
Well, speaking of saving the day, I mean, it's already been said this episode, but China and Russia have definitely saved the day for the Myanmar military. Now, this might seem like a bit of a crazy question, but if we can imagine some kind of scenario where the Myanmar military is not being so directly supported by Russia, and I guess more importantly in this context, China. So in that scenario, would it change ASEAN's ability to influence affairs in Myanmar? Would it change the military's willingness to engage more constructively with ASEAN and ASEAN members?
An interesting twist to that is actually if you look at the history of why in ASEAN wanted to invite Myanmar into its fold was precisely because of the closeness of Myanmar to the Chinese. And so the argument back then in the 90s was simply, if we have a problem in which Myanmar will fully fall under Chinese orbit, we might as well bring Myanmar into the ASEAN fold, knowing very well, obviously, that integration and all of these things is very difficult. And in fact, I would argue one of the mistakes of ASEAN when they admitted Myanmar was, welcome Myanmar, thank you, and good luck. But there was no like consistent engagement at the people to people level, business, track two, military, political, what have you. And so when the coup happened, I can tell you in 2021, very few people around Southeast Asia understood, who do we call? Do we know anyone? Do we understand what's going on? Which acronym is which group? I can tell you that directly from a couple of actual ASEAN diplomats who work on the issue and said, I need like 2 months just to understand which group is which. And so what that means, I think, is the issue on external parties like China, like India, is definitely important, but is not as important as, I think, a better understanding of Myanmar stakeholders themselves. That's number one. Number two, I would say China's relationship and how China goes to the mat, for lack of better terms, on behalf of Myanmar across ASEAN, that will change the dynamic. So if right now, hypothetically, China is going around the region saying you all should accept an election result in whatever format of a sham election that might happen, is that something that will change the dynamics? Absolutely. I think China brings a lot to the table in ASEAN meetings that is 10 times a lot more powerful in the minds of ASEAN policymakers than what Myanmar singularly can say, right? So what China does really does matter for how ASEAN sees Myanmar. But if what we are talking about is China saying, you know what, we call on democracy, we don't believe the junta is the right way to go, let's bring back all the political parties again and let's rerun election, that would also change ASEAN's mind about Myanmar as well. So as China goes, the weight of the Myanmar issue in ASEAN will go as well. So if China does nothing and say nothing, then to be honest, ASEAN have no choice but to figure things out themselves. And that's not always the worst thing. So this is where I think China's sort of role going back to 1027, the various, however you want to call ceasefires afterwards, the potential of an election, China's management of scam centers and all of these things is important. But whether or not you look at it as the most important issue for China. So if China has 5 agenda to deal with in ASEAN, is Myanmar number 1? Or is South China Sea number 1? US number 2? Oil and gas number 3? So the prioritization of Myanmar in China will affect how I think ASEAN see Myanmar as well.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, to finish up, you mentioned the election. There still remains the very real possibility that the Myanmar military, when the state of emergency expires later this year, the current state of emergency, they will call an election. It's been talked about for years. And such an election, the semblance of an election for show, partial in only a quarter of the country, a performative election, any kind of election, would be directly supported by the People's Republic of China, and it's what they want. So if such an election was to occur, would ASEAN recognize it? And would that make ASEAN even more complicit in the military's crimes and complicit in sustaining and legitimizing the illegal coup of 2021?
So I foresee a couple of different options for ASEAN if, let's assume for a second there is some form of an election completely not representative, etc., etc. But let's assume for a second that's the case. So not a great election, let's put it that way. Option number 1, ASEAN can send in its own monitoring mission as in be there, actually monitor, and certify or not certify. But that's a different outcome. But the point is, there is an ASEAN direct involvement in the election process, right? That's option one. Option two, no monitoring mission. Simply take the word of either China or Myanmar or Thailand, perhaps, and try to get a question put to the table to the ASEAN leaders. Do we bring back whoever wins the election as the legitimate representative of Myanmar at the seat of ASEAN table? So that's option two, which you don't really have direct information, and you try to make a call about whether or not you make a decision to bring back Myanmar into the fold. Option number three could be where ASEAN reached a point where we don't have enough information. We don't want to be a part of the election because nobody wants to start the business of being the judge of each other's domestic legitimacy. Because the one thing that you have to remember about ASEAN is that everything the organization does now can be revert back to them in the future. So if now ASEAN is in the habit of judging the quality of elections, who's to say in 5 years, somebody from Laos can say, why don't you have election monitoring in Laos or Indonesia or Philippines? And so nobody wants to start that business, right? But of course, Myanmar is unique in many different ways. So it's also possible that they say, we're only doing this for Myanmar and nobody else. Possible, but you never know. If there is no information and if there is no involvement in on the ground, as in there's no monitoring mission, then ASEAN can simply go back to status quo, as in, we wait until there is a certification and no violence, what have you. But ASEAN needs to come up with some form of language, essentially saying, for now, we're not saying we're admitting or not. Right now, we're going to wait until there's a new government sworn in, there's political stability returning, and et cetera, until we can conveniently say we are re-inviting back whoever is the political government of the day. So I feel like those three options would be on the table if there is an election. But one thing, again, that's interesting about ASEAN is also everything is based on calendar. If the election were to happen, shall we say, before the ASEAN summit, so ASEAN summit is usually twice a year, around the middle of the year and towards the end of the year, usually November, and the middle of the year is usually around May or June. The momentum would be different. If an election happens before the summit, then it will become a topic in the summit. But if it doesn't happen before the summit, then nobody will talk about it. Then it means it's the foreign minister who has to make the assessment, and then maybe we'll discuss it 6 months later. So that gives them time to not make a decision, right? So yeah, my sense is when the election happens, who is there on the election as an observer or monitoring mission or what have you, and whether or not Thailand, China will vouch for whatever the results are or not. But my impression is that ASEAN would not be pulled kicking and screaming if there was a pressure by Thailand, by China, and others, and say, look, this is our way to say we're done with the 5-point consensus. There's a legitimate government in Yangon or Naypyidaw, and then we're done. Because as I said earlier, this is a hot potato. I'm not sure people want to get embroiled on this. And if they see now what happened in Ukraine, as in, look, the war is exhausting, let's just find a quick way to end this, not a just way, not a sustainable way, but a quick way, who's to say that won't be in the mind of the ASEAN leaders when there is an election?
Thank you, Evan. I think there's a lot of skepticism that would ever end it. But that was an informative discussion. Wonderful. So again, really, really appreciate you coming on the show and outlining all those considerations regarding the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Myanmar. So cheers, Evan.
Thanks for having me.
before I sign off, in case that wasn't enough ASEAN for you, let me draw your attention to the opinion piece published last week on Frontier Myanmar by Sai Lat, in which he calls for greater creativity in the 5-point consensus, and Frontier's most recent Political Insider newsletter, which is available to subscribers, focused in detail on how Malaysia may handle Myanmar as the 2025 ASEAN chair. And let me point you to the bumper crop of feature stories published by Frontier this week. Check out the piece on a Nepali Chin grandmother and others who are staying in war zones, forming the invisible backbone of the armed struggle against military rule. Then there's a feature on Thailand's moves against the scam centres, and one on the ongoing uncertain fate of Lashio. Then there's a feature on the auctioning of the imprisoned Daw Aung Suu Kyi's house in Yangon at the behest of her estranged brother. Is it a legal farce? Well, check these out on the Frontier website. Thank you for tuning in for another week, and farewell. Take care.